Hello, my name is Ezenwa Ongbenu, and the topic of this discussion is how to starve cancer with a ketogenic diet. Now, cancer is a devastating disease. It's the second leading cause of death in the developed world, and its incidence is growing at such a high rate that it will soon overtake heart disease as the leading cause of death in the developed world. And even in the developing countries, cancer is of epidemic proportions. We're seeing double-digit increases in the incidence of certain types of cancer. So it's truly devastating and very deadly. Now, the causes are varied. It has to do with diet, with environmental toxin exposures, and certain infectious conditions, both bacterial and viral. So cancer is not one disease. It's highly varied. Even the cancer in one person's body is highly varied too, because as the cancer cells divide, their nature, their virulence, their characteristics also change. So it's a continuously evolving condition. Now, the medical establishment is waging a so-called war on cancer. But the problem, in my understanding, has to do with the weapons that are utilized in fighting that war. Because the conventional paradigm limits us to surgical interventions, to chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Now, chemotherapy and radiotherapy are highly toxic and of themselves are also carcinogenic. That is, they also promote cancers in their own way. And we can see the limitations of the conventional approach in just the terrible outcomes. So we have fairly poor outcomes when we only apply surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy. So what else can we really do? Well, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, who is a neuroscientist at Boston College, has given us a new paradigm and a new understanding of cancer. Because once we understand the disease process, then we can also understand new interventions. And that's where this ketogenic diet comes in. So, let me just briefly explain the conventional paradigm of cancer. We have the cell, and in the cell there are many types of organelles, which are compartments within the cell that are engaged in various types of activity. But all the activity in the cell is coordinated by the nucleus, which contains genetic information. And it's the expression or the utilization of that stored information that determines the nature and the operation of the cell. Now, cancer cells have genetic mutations. And in the conventional understanding, we understand that cancer is driven by these genetic mutations, also called oncogenes. But Dr. Thomas Seyfried has given us a new understanding, and that understanding centers on another organelle, because the nucleus is just but one of several organelles. Now we're understanding that the cancer disease process also involves another organelle that is called the mitochondrion. Now, in each cell, there are numerous mitochondria, depending on the energy requirement of the cell, because the function of the mitochondrion is to generate energy. It's essentially the power plant of the cell, and it generates chemical energy in the form of ATP, which means adenosine triphosphate. Now, ATP drives the protein machinery of the cell, because proteins are essentially the machinery of life, and most of them are powered by ATP. So all the necessary chemical reactions and biomolecular transformations that occur millions upon millions of times every second in a cell in order to keep it a living entity is driven by this ATP, which is produced by the mitochondrion, which is hugely important. So Seyfried's insight has to do with the fact that all cancer cells demonstrate mitochondrial dysfunction. And that mitochondrial dysfunction ultimately leads to genetic mutations. So genetic mutations are a secondary phenomenon, and the primary driver is now of a metabolic nature, essentially the mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, what that means, or a manifestation of that mitochondrial dysfunction, is that there is a degree of metabolic inflexibility in cancer cells. And the relevant molecule is glucose. Let me explain a little bit. Glucose is a hugely important molecule in the body. It's a source of energy. Most cells in the body utilize glucose for energy. Some cells more than others. Like your brain is voracious. It's a voracious consumer of glucose. But all cells, all normal cells, have the ability to transition from glucose to what they call ketone bodies. And it is from that ketone bodies that we get the ketogenic diet. So I will explain this a bit. On the one hand, we have carbohydrates, which break down into glucose, into sugars, such as glucose, fructose, and others. And then we have fatty acids, which break down into ketone bodies, which include beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate and acetone. Now, what this really means is just this. All cells in your body, when glucose is lacking, they're able to utilize the breakdown product of fatty acids for energy, ketone bodies, because they have normal mitochondria. Because remember, all cancer cells have mitochondrial dysfunction. They have abnormal power plants. And that abnormality manifests itself as a serious glucose addiction, or a dependency on glucose for energy generation. Now, this inflexibility creates a therapeutic window. It creates a channel of intervention if we're able to limit the availability of glucose in the body and increase the relative amount of ketone bodies available in the body. We're able to nourish normal cells and effectively starve cancer cells. So that is why a ketogenic diet can possibly starve cancer cells. And it's not even just possibly, because this is not theoretical. Dr. Thomas Seyfried has done lots of work, both with mice and with a few patients, and they're expanding clinical trials, and the results are just astounding with this ketogenic diet. So this is not some flight of fancy or just a theoretical notion. It's very, very practical, and it's very, very real. And I dare say this is possibly the future of cancer therapy, because the results are quite astounding. And it taps into a fundamental weakness of cancer, because cancer is a metabolic monster. It grows rapidly. It uses resources rapidly. It monopolizes resources. It's so voracious that sometimes it engulfs neighboring cells in order to gain enough building blocks to drive its growth. But it has a fatal flaw, which is the mitochondrial dysfunction. So it's dependent on glucose. And without glucose, it's lacking the necessary raw material to thrive, to divide, to replicate, and to spread all around the body. So, a ketogenic diet. What are the characteristics of a ketogenic diet? And a ketogenic diet is quite similar to an Atkins diet, but it has certain important modifications, because not all fats are good, right? The emphasis is really on healthy fats. So it has two planks. One, which is total calorie restriction, or total caloric restriction. Because in order to lower blood glucose levels, that is, in order to limit the availability of the raw material that cancer cells need to thrive, we have to reduce food intake generally. And that involves possibly reducing your caloric intake by more than 50%. So it involves intermittent fasting. So for possibly half the day, you won't eat food, and when you eat food, you eat much less than you normally would. So it's total caloric restriction, possibly 1,000 calories a day, as opposed to 2,500 or 3,000 calories that the average person consumes a day. So the first plank is total caloric restriction, because this of itself lowers blood glucose, and the lowered blood glucose will limit the availability of the necessary raw materials for cancer cells to generate energy. So it puts metabolic stress on cancer cells. So that automatically limits its growth rate, limits its ability to spread, limits its ability to wreak havoc. It will essentially go into a dormant state. Then the second plank is elimination of carbohydrates from the diet. So whole grains out the window, white flour out the window, refined sugars out the window, soft drinks out the window. Foods that break down into sugars must be minimalized, and they're going to be replaced with high amounts. So this second plank has several components: elimination of carbohydrates, high amounts of healthy fats, high intake of healthy fats. Now, healthy fats are hugely important because, like, fried foods are rich in fat, but that is not an anti-cancer diet. So the emphasis must be on healthy fats. So what are some healthy fats? Well, healthy fats include avocados. They include egg, and not fried egg, but like boiled eggs. They include certain animal products, for example, your beef and your chicken. Those are sources of healthy fats. They include coconut oil, olive oil. They include several nuts that are rich in oils, varied nuts, both your almonds, both your cashew nuts, both your walnuts. Those are all sources of healthy fats. So fried foods, no way. Trans fatty foods, no way. Essentially, highly processed foods, no way. Anything fried, no way. So it's a particular type of fat, high intake of healthy fats. Your olives, your olive oil, and then moderate amounts of protein. Moderate amounts of protein. And that includes like legumes, your beans, your lentils, your peas, and also proteins from vegetables, green leafy vegetables, your carrots, your onions, your garlic. So a ketogenic diet comprises of two things. You reduce caloric intake, and then you make a substitution in your diet, because what you're trying to create is a transition in energy use in your body, or a transition in the substrate that is used for energy in your body away from glucose and towards ketone bodies, which are the breakdown products of fat. So fats must comprise like 60 to 70% of your caloric intake on a ketogenic diet. But fat is a double-edged sword, because you have to be very careful of the sources of fat. That's why I emphasize healthy fats, including avocados, certain types of nuts, and then some animal products, preferably organic animal products, and then coconut oil and olive oil, and of course coconuts, whole coconuts, and then obviously whole olives. But certain types of fats, such as like your vegetable oils, your soybean oil, your corn oil, your canola oil, they're rich in certain types of fatty acids that are not good for health. So vegetable oils are not part of a ketogenic diet. All fried foods are not part of a ketogenic diet. Highly processed oils, for example, like your partially hydrogenated vegetable oils that are used in so many processed foods, both bread, both cookies, both pastries, many packaged food, those types of highly processed fats, also called trans fats or partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, are disastrous for health. So they're not part of a ketogenic diet. So a ketogenic diet, healthy fats, and then moderate amounts of protein and high quality protein, clean sources of protein such as egg, such as organic beef, poultry. And if you're not able to get high quality animal products, I would suggest that you eliminate animal products, because you're still going to be exposed to a lot of harmful synthetics like antibiotics, like synthetic growth hormones, and also many other types of medications that are fed to conventionally raised livestock. And these chemicals all bioaccumulate, and when we eat them, they act as carcinogens, and they also disrupt the fine chemical balance in the body. They disrupt hormonal signals in the body, which of themselves can also generate cancer. So a ketogenic diet is essentially a very clean diet, and the proteins can be sourced from varied vegetables. So like juicing vegetables is a great idea on a ketogenic diet. And then, of course, increasing your intake of healthy fats. And it's even possible to take like a couple tablespoons of like olive oil or coconut oil on a ketogenic diet, just to boost the fat intake, the healthy fat intake. Because unlike taking a tablespoon of vegetable oil, which would be disastrous for your health, taking a tablespoon or several tablespoons of high quality extra virgin olive oil or virgin coconut oil will actually do wonders for your health, because they're composed of a different sort of fatty acid, and it's a fatty acid that the body really needs in order to experience vibrant health. So ketogenic diet is really the future of cancer therapy, or it's a plank of itself. It's a facet of where we're headed in cancer therapy, because there are other components, but this is a very, very powerful tool, because it exploits a metabolic weakness of cancer cells, which is a dependency on glucose. When you apply a ketogenic diet, blood glucose levels drop. Obviously, glucose still remains, but it drops. And then the level of ketone bodies, which are the breakdown products of fatty acids, increases. So there is a shift. There is a metabolic transition. And all the cells of your body, all your normal cells are not affected, because they have a ancestrally conserved ability to make that transition. But cancer cells, due to their mitochondrial dysfunction, are not able to make that transition. And they are essentially starved because they can't use ketone bodies for energy. Now, I hope you found this talk useful, and thank you so much for your time.